We tried again and again to prevent this war. And for the sake of peace, we put up with a lot of things happening which ought not to have happened. But now we are at war, and we are going to make war, and persevere in making war until the other side have had enough of it. We have been agreeably surprised that 10 weeks have been allotted to us to get into fighting trim. We are in a very different position from that we were in 10 weeks ago. We are far stronger than we were 10 weeks ago. We are far better prepared to endure the worst malice of Hitler and his Huns than we were at the beginning of September. It is growing in numbers and improving in training every day. I shall not attempt to prophesy whether the frenzy of a cornered maniac will drive Herr Hitler into the worst of all his crimes. But this I will say, without a doubt, that the fate of Holland and Belgium, like that of Poland, Czechoslovakia and Austria, will be decided by the victory of the British Empire and the French Republic. If we are conquered, all will be enslaved, and the United States will be left single-handed to guard the rights of men. If we are not destroyed, all these countries, ancient countries, many of them, will be rescued and restored to life and freedom. It may well be that the final extinction of a baleful domination will pave the way to a broader solidarity of all the men in all the lands than we could ever have planned if we had not marched together through the fire.
Britain did have one weapon that was ready for war: the Royal Navy. Shortly after war was declared, it had swept German shipping from the high seas. The British fleet were deployed at Suez, Malta, Gibraltar, in the Channel, and in the North Sea, blockading Germany. World conquest for Germany would be impossible without first taking Britain. Between Britain and Germany stood not only France, but also the countries of Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The people of these small neutral countries were peaceful, hardworking, and free. They knew they were in the middle and feared violation of their neutrality. Hitler knew this. He also knew that if they united with the Allies, they would form a solid democratic wall against Nazi aggression, and that conquest would be far more difficult. So, before striking with his armies, he used another weapon, the propaganda barrage, to confuse, to make them lose faith, to divide and conquer. To lull the fears of the neutrals, Propaganda Minister Goebbels told them Germany didn't want a war at all. It was Britain and France that caused all the trouble. Then it was Hitler's turn. In his speech on October the 6th, 1939, he made them all kinds of specific promises. To the Danes, he said, "We have concluded a non-aggression pact with Denmark." To the Norwegians, he said, "Germany never had any conflict with the northern states and has none today." To the Dutch, he said, "The new Reich has endeavored to continue the traditional friendship with Holland." And to the Belgians, he announced, "The Reich has put forth no claim which might in any way be regarded as a threat to Belgium." And while Hitler was making these promises, his generals were cold-bloodedly picking out the first victim, Norway. Why did they pick Norway? Its many steep inlets and fjords would make excellent U-boat bases from which raiders could prey on British supply lines. Also, it would give the Nazis vital air bases. The British naval base and the blockade fleet was at Scapa Flow. At this time, the German-based bombers couldn't reach them. Possession of bases on Norway's western shore would bring these vital British defenses under easy bomber attack. But he couldn't take Norway without first taking Denmark, the springboard for his attack. So, at dawn on April the 9th, 1940, the German army rode across the neutral corners of Denmark and in a matter of hours had occupied the entire country. By nightfall, Denmark was erased as a nation. The Danes were now under the Nazi jackboot, although only 6 months before Hitler had announced, "We have concluded a non-aggression pact with Denmark." Meanwhile, in Norway, German merchant ships had sneaked inside Norway's neutral waterway and tied up at all principal ports. However, these were not in fact peaceful merchant ships at all. They were packed full below decks with German stormtroops and equipment. At the same time, Nazi warships, discovered along the entire coastline, steamed up the Norwegian fjords. Ships, transports, tanks, men, aircraft, all pounced simultaneously upon a defenseless country. Paratroopers immediately seized every strategic Norwegian airfield. The whole job was made easier by treacherous columnists led by Major Quisling, who seized power and issued orders to suppress resistance. Nazi warships steamed past silent guns that could have blasted them out of the water. This was one of the most amazing acts of treachery the world has ever known. It brought Major Quisling international fame, making his very name synonymous with the word traitor. By the afternoon of April the 9th, the Germans were in complete control of all 7 ports where they had landed in the morning. For the first time in more than 200 years, the people of Norway saw an invading army parading through their cities. Many of these Nazi soldiers, strutting as conquerors in 1940, had last seen Norway some 20 years earlier. As refugee German children, they had been raised and cared for by kind Norwegians. Now, these same Germans were back to repay that kindness with terror and destruction. Once they had occupied the capital, the Nazis quickly spanned out in all directions. The Royal Norwegian troops stopped one German column between Hamar and Elverum. So, the Luftwaffe deployed their bombers. Norwegians were forced to flee to the north under constant bombardment from air attack. It was here that Captain Robert Wallasey, an American military attaché, was killed, the first American soldier to lose his life in this war. Meanwhile, the Nazis had spread all over the country. Small patrols occupied every strategic village. Parachute troops landed high in the mountains. Unopposed bombing raids sent defenseless civilians fleeing in stark terror. The Norwegians hadn't wanted war. They had done everything to avoid it. Hoping they could escape the Nazi scourge, They had compromised and tragically failed to unite with the other democracies, and now they faced the German might defenseless and alone. For before the Allies could come to their aid, the Germans were in control of all principal ports. Regardless of this, British, French, and Polish contingents made several landings along the Norwegian coast. They landed forces north and south of Trondheim and attempted an encircling movement on the city under constant heavy and almost entirely unopposed air attack. The scene of the action was out of range of British fighter planes. So the Royal Navy brought up aircraft carriers, but these are at a disadvantage when opposed by land-based planes. The Allies, therefore, were badly battered from the air. Finally, suffering heavy losses, they withdrew from the hopeless situation. Further to the north at Narvik, they met with better success, inflicting heavy naval losses on the Nazis. They made landings and held the town for nearly 2 months. They also took their first prisoners of war in the conflict. Again, the Nazis' overwhelming air superiority proved a deciding factor. The Allies were forced to withdraw under terrific air bombardment. Loyal Norwegians were left with their quislings, their ruins, and their dead. Even though 6 months before, Hitler had said Germany never had any conflict with the northern states, and has none today. Hitler had another victory. He'd hijacked 2 more countries. He'd clubbed Norway into submission and got what he wanted, bases for use against Britain. Now he had the northern claw of an enormous pincer movement. A drive through France would give him the southern claw. A blockade by U-boats coupled with mass bombing attacks would weaken the British for final invasion. Then, with Britain gone, Germany could reach out in all directions for world conquest. His next move was obviously to be through France, to get his southern claw. How was France to face the onslaught? The French had already built the mighty chain of fortresses called the Maginot Line. These tremendous bastions were built deep into the French land. They were connected by underground passages and railways, guarding France's eastern borders facing Germany. And when France was finally forced to declare war against the rising Nazi menace, the French troops, instead of attacking, marched into their modern caves to wait for the Nazi blitz to smash itself against the Maginot Line. Their generals, headed by Marshal Pétain, had announced, "Whoever makes the first move in this war will be hurt." But Hitler didn't go near the Maginot Line. That was France's strong point. Instead, he attacked the weak point. Hitler knew that the French had tried to avoid war instead of preparing for it. That knowledge was one of his greatest weapons. He knew they had planes, but he knew they were antiquated. He knew they had tanks, but he knew they were few in number and lightly armored. But most important of all, he knew that France had become a cynical and disillusioned nation. The French had lost their united spirit. During the months of military inactivity called the Phony War, a ceaseless barrage of German propaganda crossed the still waters of the Rhine to affect the soldiers in the Maginot Line. "Why do you fight?" asked the banners. Poems and friendly notes were sent over by balloons. French tunes were played by German bands, and anti-British propaganda was broadcast in French. France appeared ready to be conquered. The whole force of the Nazi might was turned towards the west. Holland and Belgium still clung to their neutrality. Blocking the German advance was the dense forest of the Ardennes. Its roads, narrow trails, its bridges too weak for military vehicles. French strategists estimated the forest of the Ardennes impassable for armored forces. This was one of the costliest estimates in all military history. That was the situation on May the 9th, 1940. The hour of trial had come. The people of the democracies prayed for strength to the coming hurricane of terror. While across the Rhine,
Juden ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit
a delirious menace possessed the German nation.
als Dauererscheinung für uns, unser Oberster, wird die Einführung der allgemeinen immer wieder herniedersteigen. Und dass man die Wahrheit über Deutschland berichtet. 50.000 Mann auf den Baustellen, der ganz Deutschland erfasste. Überall herrscht seit einem Jahr Regen. Und für den deutschen Die Reinheit seine Rasse hält. Hitler aber ist Deutschland wie Deutschland. Deshalb innerlich nicht zu uns gehört.
For Britain, there was a major turn of events which was to affect the remainder of the war. Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister. The man who had boasted peace in our time was to be replaced by Winston Churchill. Without even bothering to declare war on the 10th of May 1940, the German armies launched a coordinated attack across the neutral borders of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland from the Maginot Line north to the sea. The action along the entire front was simultaneous. So, for the purposes of clarity, we take up one country at a time. First, This is what happened in Holland. Nazi ground forces smashed through the improvised and hastily erected border defenses. But the main attack was to come from the air, far behind defense lines. Over 10,000 troops were landed in this manner, before the stunned citizens of Rotterdam even knew they were at war. These troops, aided by well-trained 5th columnists, quickly captured the airport and outlying sections of the city. Meantime, Nazi armored columns were racing across their country, their progress speeded by other 5th columnists who prevented the destruction of vital dikes and bridges. These forces effected a meeting with the parachutists landed in Rotterdam. The Dutch were doomed to defeat. On the 4th day of the invasion, the Nazis gave the Dutch general an ultimatum. All Dutch resistance must cease, or Rotterdam will be bombed flat. The Dutch general had little choice. To save the lives of innocent civilians, he accepted the German terms. But after the unconditional surrender, the Nazis bombed the city anyway. Flights of unopposed German bombers flew low over the center of Rotterdam and methodically bombed it into a heap of rubble. This was one of the most ruthless exhibitions of savagery the world had ever seen. Over 30,000 men, women, and children were killed in the space of 90 minutes. Though only 6 months before, Hitler had said, "The new Reich has endeavored to continue the traditional friendship with Holland." Meantime, in Belgium, the whole force of Nazi blitzkrieg had stormed across its neutral borders. The main German attack was directed at the Eben-Canal-Meuse river line, the anchor of which was Fort Eben-Emil, a seemingly impregnable fortress. The Germans had secretly built a replica of the mighty fortress in Czechoslovakia and had rehearsed the attack until they knew every detail of the fort's construction and its every weakness. When the real attack came, it was foolproof. Specially trained engineer battalions, all working together as a well-trained team. They knew exactly where to cross the river. You will notice that this assault engineer knows exactly where to put his high explosive charge in order to destroy the blockhouse. Fort Eben-Emil withstood the Nazi attack exactly 2 days, and the Germans rolled on. Meantime, an hour and a half after the German invasion began, Allied troops crossed the French and Belgian border to meet the advancing Germans. As they raced across Belgium to take up their defense positions, they met an obstacle they hadn't counted on: refugees. The Nazis methodically bombed little towns and villages, otherwise devoid of any military value. Not so much to kill as to drive the inhabitants out into the highways, hopelessly entangling advancing Allied armies. Refugees used as a weapon of war, a new low in inhumanity. No school today, the sign says. The children are otherwise occupied. Although only 6 months before Hitler had announced, "The Reich has put forth no claim which might in any way be regarded as a threat to Belgium." The Belgians will not forget. But the attack on Belgium and Holland was only a feint. The main German attack was to be centered where the Allies least expected it, through the Ardennes forest. For this decisive blow, they had secretly assembled the mightiest striking force the world had ever seen, including 45,000 armored vehicles. At the same time that the Nazi armies were plunging into Holland and Belgium, this column started to move. Well-trained engineer battalions went first. They were opposed only by scattered Allied patrols. They cleared pathways for the tanks to follow. In 3 days, the Germans' armored force reached the Meuse River, 2 days faster than the French thought any troops could get through. By all rules, the Germans should have paused here to bring up heavy artillery before attempting to cross the river. But the Nazis had a new type of artillery, dive bombers. With them, they blasted the French positions across the Meuse. With feverish haste, the Germans laid a barrage across the river with anything and everything that would shoot. This tremendous concentration of firepower continued all through the night. By the following day, shock troops were able to get across the river. These shock troops held the bridgehead until the engineers brought up pontoons and built bridges. Then, without wasting a moment, across these bridges the main armored force of the German military machine rolled through the Sedan for the all-important breakthrough into the dismayed and flat-footed France. For the Allies, the writing was on the wall. Defeat was inevitable. It was now only a matter of how long they could hold out.
In the hideous dilemma which now presented itself, we accepted the Weygand plan and made loyal and persistent, though now ineffectual, efforts to carry it out until the 25th, when all the communications being cut, our weak counterattack being repulsed through the loss of Arras, the Belgian front being broken, and King Leopold about to capitulate, all hope of escape to the southward vanished. There remained only the sea. Could we reach it, or must we be surrounded and broken up in the open field? In any case, the whole artillery and equipment of our army, irreplaceable for many months, must be lost. But what was that compared with saving the army, the nucleus and structure upon which alone Britain could build our armies of the future? Lord Gort, who had from the 25th onwards felt that evacuation by sea was our only chance, now proceeded to form a bridgehead around Dunkirk and to fight his way into it with what strength remained. All the discipline of the British and the qualities of their commanders, who included Brooke, Alexander and Montgomery, were to be needed. Much more was to be needed. All that man could do was done. Would it be enough? It was Tuesday, the 28th of May, and I did not attend the House until that day week. There was no advantage to be gained by a further statement in the interval, nor did members express a wish for one. But everyone realized that the fate of our army, and perhaps much else, might well be decided by then. I had not seen many of my colleagues outside the War Cabinet, except individually, since the formation of the government. And I thought it right to have a meeting in my room at the House of Commons of all ministers of cabinet rank other than the War Cabinet members. We were perhaps 25 round the table. I described the course of events, and I showed them plainly where we were, and all that was in the balance. Then I said quite casually, and not treating it as a point of special significance, of course, whatever happens at Dunkirk, we shall fight on. There occurred a demonstration which, considering the character of the gathering, 25 experienced politicians and parliament men, who represented all the different points of view, whether right or wrong, before the war, surprised me. Quite a number seemed to jump up from the table and come running to my chair, shouting and patting me on the back. There is no doubt that had I at this juncture faltered at all in the leading of the nation, I should have been hurled out of office. I was sure that every minister was ready to be killed quite soon and have all his family and possessions destroyed rather than give in. In this they represented the House of Commons and almost all the people. It fell to me in these coming days and months to express their sentiments on suitable occasions. This I was able to do because they were mine also. There was a white glow, overpowering, sublime, which ran through our island from end to end. The Admiralty did not hesitate to give full rein to the spontaneous movement which swept the seafaring population of our south and southeastern shores. Everyone who had a boat of any kind, steam or sail, put out for Dunkirk, and the preparations, fortunately begun a week earlier, were now aided by the brilliant improvisation of volunteers on an amazing scale. The numbers arriving on the 29th were small, but they were the forerunners of nearly 400 small craft, which from the 31st were destined to play a vital part by ferrying from the beaches to the off-lying ships almost 100,000 men. Altogether, there came to the rescue of the army under the ceaseless air bombardment of the enemy about 850 vessels, of which nearly 700 were British and the rest Allied. Meanwhile, ashore around Dunkirk, the occupation of the perimeter was effected with precision. The troops arrived out of chaos and were formed in order along the defenses, which even in 2 days had grown. Hitler's belief that the German Air Force would render escape impossible, and that therefore he should keep in armored formations for the final stroke of the campaign, was a mistaken but not unreasonable view. 3 factors falsified his expectations. First, the incessant air bombing of the masses of troops along the seashore did them very little harm. The bombs plunged into the soft sand, which muffled their explosions. In the early stages, after a crashing air raid, the troops were astonished to find that hardly anybody had been killed or wounded. Everywhere there had been explosions, but scarcely anyone was the worse. A rocky shore would have produced far more deadly results. Presently, the soldiers regarded the air attacks with contempt. They crouched in the sand dunes with composure and growing hope. Before them lay the grey but not unfriendly sea. Beyond, the rescuing ships and home. The second factor which Hitler had not foreseen was the slaughter of his army. British and German air quality was put directly to the test. By intense effort, Fighter Command maintained successive patrols over the sea and fought the enemy at long odds. Hour after hour they bit into the German fighter and bomber squadrons, taking a heavy toll, scattering them and driving them away. Day after day this went on, till the glorious victory of the Royal Air Force was gained. Wherever German aircraft were encountered, sometimes in 40s and 50s, they were instantly attacked, often by single squadrons or less, and shot down in scores, which presently added up to hundreds. The whole Metropolitan Air Force, our last sacred reserve, was used. Sometimes the fighter pilots made 4 sorties a day. A clear result was obtained. The superior enemy were beaten or killed, and for all their bravery, mastered or even cowed. This was a decisive clash. Unhappily, the troops on the beaches saw very little of this epic conflict in the air, often miles away or above the clouds. They knew nothing of the loss inflicted on the enemy. All they felt was the bombs scourging the beaches cast by the foes who had got through, but did not perhaps return. There was even a bitter anger in the army against the Air Force, and some of the troops landing at Dover or Thames ports in their ignorance insulted men in Air Force uniform. They should have clasped their hands, but how could they know? In Parliament I took pains to spread the truth. But all the aid of the sand and all the prowess in the air would have been vain without the sea. The instructions given 10 or 12 days before had, under the pressure and emotion of events, borne amazing fruit. Perfect discipline prevailed ashore and afloat. The sea was calm. To and fro between the shore and the ships plied the little boats, gathering the men from the beaches as they waded out, or picking them from the water, with total indifference to the air bombardment which often claimed its victims. Their numbers alone defied air attack. The mosquito armada as a whole was unsinkable. In the midst of our defeat, glory came to the island people, united and unconquerable, and the tale of the Dunkirk beaches will shine in whatever records are preserved of our affairs.
The situation that now faced France was as nearly hopeless as a military situation can be. 2/5 of the French army were lost. Despairing people of Paris sent their children south in the hope that some miracle would keep them from harm. The hopeless men of the French army, without adequate arms or equipment, braced themselves for the coming blow. At the same time, Mussolini sent his divisions racing across the border.
The hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
Organized resistance in France was no longer possible. The government faced two alternatives: retire to North Africa and carry on from there, or give up the struggle. France's leaders were old and tired, and the oldest and most tired was Marshal Pétain. Persuaded by Laval, who saw in Germany victory his chance for personal power, on June the 16th, Pétain asked for an armistice. The news was carried to Hitler, who received this word of a great nation's fall in a characteristic manner. Also characteristic were his terms for the armistice. It must be signed in the coach where Marshal Foch met the defeated Germans in the last war. The French delegation arrived to pay the final price of French disunity and the treachery of some of its leaders. The final price, a price for which centuries to come the French would never forget. More than 3/5 of the country was to be blacked out by military occupation. The remainder was to be controlled by a French government acceptable to Hitler. A tax of 400 million francs a day was to be imposed on the French people to support the German army of occupation. Nearly 2 million French prisoners of war were to be taken into Germany and kept there as hostages, to work as slaves or rot of hunger, tuberculosis, or other diseases in concentration camps. These men were deliberately and permanently separated from their families in order to decrease the French birth rate and thus eliminate France as a world power in future generations. And for those attempting to protest against these restrictions, thousands of innocent French civilians were executed. This was the price the French paid as they signed the armistice. Hitler went to Paris to tour the streets of what had been known as the City of Light. There were no cheering crowds to welcome in the new order. When the people of Paris came to the streets again, it was to hear the voice of the invaders, telling them what they must do, how they must live, what they must say, what they must think, telling them how to exist under German occupation. Gone was the Republic of France. Gone was free speech and a free representative government. Gone was liberty, equality, fraternity. These were the French. Although they listened, their minds and their hearts were down on the Mediterranean, where the battle colors of the regiments were taken to Africa out of the Nazi grasp. The people wept as their glory departed, but they didn't know that France had a glint of hope from a rallying point. Charles de Gaulle, a soldier, did not surrender. He vowed to continue to fight. Gathering about him loyal Frenchmen from all over the world, he organized what became the Free French Army. But for most of the world, France had fallen. Nazi propagandists, making full use of the new weapon, the radio, immediately turned their propaganda machine on the people of Britain.
The Blitzkrieg will be carried over the British Islands with greater, more appalling rapidity than over Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, or France.
Only one state still stood against Germany, Western Europe's offshore island, Britain. and Britain had its Spitfires, flown by resolute and skillful RAF pilots. In combat against this nimble fighter over Dunkirk, the German pilots found for the first time that their own aircraft could be outturned and outclimbed, and for the first time they were forced to fly to the limits of their performance. This was perhaps the first indication that the Luftwaffe was not invincible. Losses were high. With the fighters being engaged in dogfights, the bombers were flying without support and suffered considerably as a consequence, as did the Stukas. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had met an opponent of equal fighting capabilities in the air, and as a consequence, prevented the Dunkirk evacuation. Following the fall of France, the Luftwaffe was withdrawn for a refit in expectation of the next phase of the war in the West, the invasion of the British Isles. As yet, however, the Luftwaffe had only a foretaste of effective and determined fighter opposition. But basking in the realms of victory, neither Goering nor his senior commanders had yet recognized its implications. For Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, the task of the Luftwaffe was twofold. One, they were to eliminate the Royal Air Force both as a fighting force and also as a ground organization. And two, they were to strangle the supply of Great Britain by destroying its ports and shipping. This was Britain in her darkest hour.
Of all the wars that we have ever waged in the long continuity of our history, there has never been one which more truly united the entire British nation and British race throughout the world than this present fearful struggle for the freedom and progress of mankind. We entered it of our own free will, without being ourselves directly assaulted. All over the world, friend and foe alike, everyone who had not the eye of faith might well have deemed our speedy ruin was at hand. Against the triumphant might of Hitler, with a greedy Italian at his tail, we stood alone, with resources so slender that one shudders to enumerate them now.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.